initiative of the Cordit Enterprise Architecture Community of Practice, and I'll give you the details on that as we go along, but I thought first we'll explain it. So what I'm here to present in its unfully formed infancy is the ideas reference architecture for digital identity. Okay, so I'll start with making a couple of assumptions. Digital identity is important. People in the room agree with me? Just nod if you think it's important. I don't need to explain to this audience why it's critical at this point in our history. The other point I want to make, digital identity is hard. Who agrees with that? Yeah, it's very hard. Okay, so that's not a great combination. It means we have to do it well. We have to get it right. But it's so hard, the odds are actually that we probably won't. So ideas, I'll work up to it. Ideas is a slightly different approach. And I think it's important to flag at the outset that there's a lot of tools, a lot of solutions for digital identity, and not just in our space, in government, in private enterprise. For example, there's the In Common initiative from Internet 2 in the US. If you go onto there, there's vast amounts of guidance and support around digital identity and identity systems there. The AAF in Australia produces excellent templates, guidelines, implementation advice. The European Interoperability Framework, fairly new, huge amount of reference architectures and templates and plans for digital identity. And then, you know, there are initiatives like OpenID Connect, and I could go on and on and on. There are vast volumes of supporting material on how to build, how to maintain, how to operate, how to do digital identity and what all the problems are with it. So ideas is not another solution framework, but it might help you to better select and use the solution frameworks that are applicable to your problems, and that's part of our goal. So the problem that ideas is addressing is not how to do your authentication. It's how to address or how to overcome the intrinsic design complexity of developing, building, and maintaining good digital identity systems. And that complexity is unavoidable. I'm sure many of you have complexity problems in your current state architectures. You probably have legacy systems that are very difficult, and you're probably looking at new use cases coming up that are quite complex to work through. They're not just complex, however, they're also complicated, and by that I mean the complexity has reached a point where it tends to exceed our ability to understand it easily. The ideas framework is not intended to eliminate complexity. There are certain intrinsic complexities in identity we can't eliminate. For example, the conflict between privacy and security drives complicated and complex solutions. If you could just say, we don't care about privacy, security would get a lot easier. If you could say, we don't really care about security all that much, we could deliver a lot more privacy, a lot more simply than we can now. There are just intrinsic trade-offs in identity that are hard to navigate. So our goal is not to eliminate or drive down that necessary complexity. That's just part of the game. It is to make the complexity intelligible and remove some of the complications and confusions. And it is to do that for designers, for people who are trying to decide the future state of their identity services and systems. And it actually came from asking many years ago when I was reading general advice and dealing with failing identity projects. You kept coming across this advice: don't start from your technology. Don't do a technology first. Who's sort of encountered that advice for many kinds of projects and systems? Don't do technology first. And so, okay, I won't. And then I couldn't find anything on how to do something else first. Everything said don't do technology first, and then basically dealt with the technology. So it's like, well, how do we not do technology first was the question that I set myself. So what I want to do is start out here and say, I've set myself a commensurate or a corresponding challenge for this presentation. How much insight, how much knowledge, how much useful information in the next few minutes can I share with you about digital identity without discussing any technology? And what I want to do when I get towards the end of this is I want to say to you, well, did I and I'll let you be the judge. So how does ideas work? Well, ideas is a reference architecture, and that means something very specific to an enterprise architect like myself. It means that it generalizes the problem. It looks for the things that are in common and looks for the patterns and then finds a way to articulate and present those as a way to approach solutions without getting lost in the details. Some people call that abstraction. I think that's an awful ugly word and I don't like to use it. I prefer generalizing because it's not abstract, it's not theoretical, it's quite specific and concrete. It just doesn't deal with the details of specific implementations. So what we do is we start with the stable characteristics of identity systems, the things that are always the same and don't change from system to system, solution to solution. Then we look at the more stable building blocks that you can organize those systems around. And then we look at how we can describe those systems in more detail. And the three perspectives that we have structured ideas around are the perspective of function, capability, and architecture. And that is also the order of stability and change. Function never changes. It hasn't since the first days of computing, and it won't. Capability changes very infrequently, and you can pick different approaches to capability depending on your context and your specific organizational needs. Sorry, take a breath. And architectures are more variable, but all these things tend to be very stable. So let's work our way through them. Oh, okay, so we start with the idea of what is digital identity for as a basis for defining function. Now, who in this room tends to fall to identity is to manage access. Identity is to manage security. If you are asked, that's what identity is for. And more fundamental than that is that identity exists to mediate relationships. It's so computers can stand for us when we are building and working in relationships over digital networks. I need an identity with my university because I have a relationship with that university. That identity enables me to experience and have that relationship across the digital network. If that relationship wasn't there, I wouldn't need that identity. Security, access controls, entitlement, and all these things are actually a function of the relationship. The accounts are a function of the relationship. The relationship comes first. So that's the first and founding principle of the ideas framework. Now, the work gets done in the transaction on a digital network. And on digital networks and in those transactions where the machines are standing in for us, there are three things that always happen, and these are the core function of any digital identity service or system. Identification. The parties involved, someone has to be able to say to one party has to be able to say to the other, who are you? What are you? And the only way that can be resolved in this transaction is by information being delivered from one party to another. It doesn't matter what protocol or system you're using, it is always the same. There is an act of identification. The second function that all identified identity systems tend to have to assess is continuity. Have I seen you before? Continuity over time. Do I have something that's yours? Or continuity over service. Are you part of a network of services that need to be coherent and work together? So does that relationship extend over more than one or two parties? And the final one is trust or assurance. And that has two aspects too. Can I trust the information you're giving me that I'm making those other two decisions on? And can I trust the context within which this exchange is taking place? So whether you're talking about a SAML assertion, an OpenID connector, OAuth loop, any kind of two-factor, three-factor, any kind of transaction, any kind of identified transaction on a network where a computer is standing in for something else, those three problems are being solved at some level. And it's always those three problems. So we can trace social identity. Should I let social identity, a Google identity or a Twitter identity, should I allow it to be a mechanism by which people can exercise their relationship with my organization? You can trace that question through these three functions. And then you can look at it against a different set of relationships. The next level of description is capability, and this is the most important value add that this framework provides. Generally, you'll find and I've always found where identity is a problem, it's viewed by the organisation as a single problem, and they're taking the one-man band approach to it. identity is not a single problem, and it doesn't have a single solution, especially in higher ed. So the capability architecture breaks identity into 4 functions: identity information management, entitle management, access management, and identity analytics. These have different business objects. They have different processes. They have different business life cycles. They require different technologies. They require a different skill set, and they have different outcomes in the organisation. The idea that we can have a group in our organisation, that's the identity management group, and somehow all of the skills, all of the knowledge, all of the tools, and all of the processes needed to make digital identity work in a complicated organisation can be owned and possessed and performed well by that one small group in your IT department is, I think, one of the reasons we struggle so badly with identity. So I'm going to break this down a little bit for you. So the idea is we look at every one of those capabilities from a generic capability model. Everyone has a business object. Each one has data objects. They have functions. They have processes that support those functions. They provide services. And they participate in collaboration where necessary for cross-functional outcomes. So it's just your standard reference model for capability. So let's just quickly look at one. So this is what that very first one might look like in a generic organisation. You'll have digital identities as your business object. Your data object will be a person data store. Your enterprise directory might be one of your output services there, and that might run into your phone book or your experts database on a university or any number of data services. That'll hopefully be on a catalog integration layer. You'll have your identity data integration, which will move the packets about information and core affiliations around your systems and services. In there, you'll have some functions: identity lifecycle control, identity mastering, attribute governance, identity resolution. You'll have managers and experts that are responsible for those functions. Below that, you'll have some core processes that will be responsible for carrying that out over time. So ID prove and assure, ID create and update. From that, you might have also user provisioning will be a cross-functional service because it'll involve identity access management, entitlement management as separate capabilities. Now, this will pan out differently in different organisations, and what's needed will be different in different cases. But by breaking this down and saying, well, I need to have identities, bits of data that represent people within a domain, and they have a life cycle, and I can manage that life cycle and give resources to that, and they will feed into a large number of services. And then I'll say, over here, I can have my access control services that onboarding systems will use for my provisioning. It's a basic divide and conquer strategy. So a part of this viewpoint too, in the capability viewpoint, this is very busy, don't worry about reading all of it, but the idea there's a generalised process perspective. And so in the identity system, you have request, create, prove, use, change, retire. In the authentication section, one of those things has floated off, sorry, I'll go back. A little placement problem there, my apologies. Model, verify, authenticate, so that's build control models for your access control. Things like location-based access, mandatory access controls, role-based access controls, it's all done there. But there's an information and business information function up there called entitlement management, where you need to start learning and discovering your roles in the organisation. It has a different life cycle entirely. Probably you'd be better off with different management responsibility, and the kind of people that need to be there are not network engineers and security experts, they're business analyst types and functional analysts. The ones who know why people need things and what value having those things are for people and how the relationships work. And there's certainly room to work collaboratively with your CRM people around the entitlement area too. That's the natural place for it in your organisation. And of course we have the identity analytics around the edge. Sorry, yes, I know what's happened here. I asked them, I've given them an updated version of this, but it hasn't been loaded onto this machine, so I'm one version back. So I was a little bit thrown by the slides. So this can be used to do things like look at process exchange. So let me just see where I am. Sorry. I'm there. So this is how you would look at compare and contrast around your process requirements. So your just-in-time provisioning touch points, like I said, I'm sorry this diagram is all out of place. I did try and fix it. And you can use that to compare your advanced provisioning process. So your advanced provisioning process doesn't involve access management to be completed. Whereas your just-in-time provisioning SAML process involves the access management function. So you can see there are these variations in how you approach it. Having a pattern, having an architecture to help you lay out your requirements this way, functionally, before you get into how we're going to do it, is very helpful for managing complexity. Now that's just the beginning of the tools that we're putting up. There'll be checklists, principles covering each of these capabilities, but by and large, the business capabilities for identity don't change much. We're also looking at developing scenario maps for these. So, for example, when we get to I'll jump ahead to architecture. So the idea is, instead of a one-man band, you have 4 skilled musicians in the organisation who are responsible for making these things work together. It's managing complexity by dividing and conquering, by breaking it down into smaller manageable functions. So identity information management, you don't want that in IT in the end. You want to get that out of IT. Entitlement management also wants to be out of IT. Analytics is security and business intelligence. And access control systems, providing a set of services that are downstream of your other functions that can provide good SAML authentication services or OAuth services or whatever you need for your infrastructure, will have the resources and the services they need, and they won't be overly complicated by having to have their own integration stacks and all these other things that tend to come along with single solution approaches. So the next thing is architectures. A little more subtle, but I'm going to go through it very quickly. Architectures are a function of domains, and identity is a function of information domains. So you have identity domains, you have authorization domains, you have role domains, you have commercial domains, you have global domains. We find that in identity there's a few architecture patterns that emerge, and these are defined by how we group and organize information. And a domain is just a set of systems on a network somewhere, any boundary, that treat information the same. They're coherent from an informational perspective. So an identity domain is a collection of identity records that all those systems treat as the same, from which an identity can be uniquely selected or can be understood. At the minute you go outside that, you're in a different domain. An authorization domain is a domain of roles and privileges that systems share. There's always more than one domain in an identity system, and you have choices over how you build your domains. And it's a good idea to take conscious control of that and have a pattern for analysing, understanding, and deciding what your domains are going to be. So there are basically 4. This is the Cloud Security Alliance analysis. It's also the OECD, I think, produced this. OECD? Yeah, I think that's the right organisation. There's quite a few organisations that focused on this taxonomy. Isolated domains, isolated architectures are one where your authorization domain, your identity domain, all your domains are on one system and the same system, and they're all commensurate with each other, and there's no differentiation between those domains. So those single system domains we used to have in the past, where the user management, authorization, lifecycle, everything is in system. However, these are making a comeback with cloud, because now if you're a SaaS person running a startup and having a small company doing the Trello thing or something, here's my one product. You're going to register users at the door, you're going to authorize them at the door, it's all going to be in the same domain. The isolated systems are coming back. Centralized we've been living with for a long time, but they tend to be centralized identity domain, but distributed authorization domains with a central system that manages those and does advanced provisioning. Federated is just domains of identity domains. They have their own uses, and the primary relationships that matter there are between organizations. And the emergent one, open, is where we kind of say it doesn't really matter. What we'll do is we'll put at the edge of identity domains or authorization domains or other domains, we will put protocols where we can get the information to establish trust. Now, this is all very esoteric, but where it gets you is to useful places. So you go, well, hang on, what happened there? Sorry. You go, I want to do some planning and strategy. So who's familiar with the Blue Ocean methodology? Yeah, it's really simple. I've just used this. So what do we want to introduce or add? What do we want to eliminate or remove? What do we want to do more of? What do we want to do less of? Thank you. Oh, I'm going to get there, no problem. So you go, well, I've got a centralized system and I've got federation and etc. And what I want to do for my architecture is I want to introduce a person registry to separate the identity lifecycle, identity information management capability, and start building that. Because currently it's just embedded in my authentication services, and frankly my directory and all my roles and groups, and I've got thousands of them and attributes everywhere, and it's a mess, so I need to get that out. I want to introduce canonical person standard, etc., etc. I might want to eliminate binding identity to accounts, which is confusing your network account with a digital identity. So I don't want to make it, when someone gets an identity, I automatically have to provision an account for them. You might want to increase how you're handling assurance at the creation point. You might want to reduce the number of systems of entry in your organisation. But what you do here might change if you're just responsible for an isolated architecture, or if you're working across a federated architecture. So the idea is that we put in scenarios, we put in checklists, we put in principles for these things, and you can use those to sort of do your planning and strategy and help identify where the key points are. So I wouldn't have the same set of principles for a centralised system for identity lifecycle management as you may have for an open or domainless or user-centric system for identity lifecycle management. And again, you would have different principles for isolated systems. Okay, so that's the crash course, really quick, condensed version. So here's the question. Did I introduce ideas to this room that help you make sense of the tangle of digital identity? Was there a sense that some order was emerging from what I was saying? Do you feel slightly better equipped to deal with the complexity now? Just a little bit, because this was a very rough summary. So I'm seeing a few nods. Anyone just going like this? No? Right. So what I want to point out is that I didn't really say anything about technology. I didn't talk about X501 directories. I didn't talk about attribute payloads or assertion. I didn't talk about privileged identity management. All those things are in the framework. But this is useful at the top level, at the design level. Part of our discipline in producing this is to apply the Feynman technique to everything we produce, which is to leave the people who consume the products of this framework feeling like they're identity experts, even if they're not coming from a technology, network engineering or security background. So, the actual work itself. So what we've done is we've set up two platforms, or two structures. One is a wiki, which is at that URL and is only just opened. So if you go there, there's a register button and the email thing is working. So if you're interested, you can collaborate. Now that is the messy place. That's where people can go. There'll be an editorial committee. Jeff Kennedy from the University of Auckland has graciously assented to be one of the people who overlooks that. This is a crowdsourced, open, come and do what you can platform for people with an interest who are willing to commit to the design principles behind the framework to say, I work on bits of this and I'll bring my knowledge to that. There's no timetable for production on this because everyone's doing it through the community of practice model. The second part of it is the publication of the framework. So the idea is we collaborate on the wiki, but unlike the in-common wiki on Internet 2 or whatever, mostly when these things are done, you go and look at them and they're kind of a half-built mess of the experts all debating and writing different things. So what we want to do with this is actually have two outputs, or one input, one output. This is, again, just a proof of concept stand-up. It's currently a WordPress template-driven public website. And the idea is you go there and you find fairly finished, polished, low-hanging fruit, checklists, outlines, principles that you can pick up and apply. And we'll be putting some forms and things in there for feedback. And also from there you can say, oh, this looks really good, can I join in? And we will be stealing mercilessly from other things. So Jeff shared with me, what was it called, Jeff, today? The My Data Framework from the Nordic. It's quite a complex framework for governments to create a system of services around people managing their own identifying data. Looking at that as we really need to strip that down, tailor it to researchers and students or whatever, take that, put it up there and give that as guidance for building identity systems, and that's something we can get permission for and spin up pretty quickly. So that's what this will be for. And like I said, now what I want to do is just That's it. That's what the ideas framework is. It's an output. It's a job of work. It's a collaboration. It's a working group with the Quartered Enterprise Community of Practice, and it's a resource that will emerge over time that anyone can use, and it will be licensed under the Creative Commons. And it will particularly pay attention to the needs of identity and digital identity in higher education. Now, what I want to do is just appeal to, to your sense of purpose at the end here. Technology, for me, is how the world offers itself to us for our use. The value of technology is only realised in the affordances that it gives to people. The design of our technical architectures, for me, is a fundamentally ethical discipline because the subject of that activity is the world in which people live and achieve their goals. And the architectures we build will either enable or constrain people in participating and pursuing their goals in life. Digital identity, because it is about enabling relationships, first and foremost, in an ever more digital world, is how relationships in that digital network will offer themselves to us. And what we can do in those relationships will be determined by how well we build our digital identity systems. So in closing, I want to ask, what kind of digital spaces will we use identity to help create? There's another presentation I've given around the traps on this where I compare universities' model to, are we a town square or are we a shopping centre? Okay, they're both public spaces. They're very different public spaces. The man who invented shopping centres, Victor Gruen, set out to create modern town squares, failed so miserably that he spent the entire rest of his life opposing shopping centres to his dying breath. He hated them with a passion, but he was passionate about building spaces for community. So if you think about the words that characterise university spaces and the university as an institution, and what we would want to see mirrored in its digital spaces, I would suggest we would be looking for words like knowledge, community, encounter, serendipity, connection, collaboration, openness, sharing. So the question is, the paradigms of digital identity that you see Google and Facebook and business analytics and big data and customer language, is that the language of higher education and of town squares, or is that the language of shopping centres? This framework is designed so that if you want to build shopping centres, you can, but it also gives you the choice to build town squares. Thank you. I have a minute or two for questions, or do I better run? Yep. Anyone? Well, I'll respond to the ramble question and comment. Well, look, in my mind, know where you are. If you've got complexity, legacy, problems, you're struggling, and you keep going back, be aware of what your constraints and opportunities are. Don't be idealistic about it. Clearly, you're not always able to say, well, this should be something and I can't do it. But if you know that the reason for your complexity, the reason for your tangle is that you have thought that this is something that just people who understand SAML or Microsoft Forefront or Oracle Identity Manager or SailPoint experts who know how to write the config files or do the Puppet scripts or something and understand PKIs, and that should, why isn't that working? So at least if you understand that there's a whole bunch of imperatives around that are not what those people are good at, well, you know where your problem is. Now, that doesn't mean you can instantly click your fingers and get the university to sign off and spinning up a new capability and hires and refactor everything. But knowing where your problem is and knowing why you're struggling with the complexity, surely that's got to help. And helps you strategize what your first step is, and maybe that works what your second step is. Maybe also you stress your people a little less because you kind of go, I've kind of been expecting you to deliver outcomes that you weren't really ever trained to deliver. And that happens a lot too. So I hope that sort of addresses you around it. But, this is about informing planning, informing decisions. It's not about prescribing them.
Thanks, Rick.
That's it. All right. Well, my email's on the program. The URLs are currently operating. There's not a lot there yet, but there will be hopefully soon. And we'll see if we can build some enthusiasm for this. Cheers.